Welcome to 5Spice, a program for simulating analog circuits. In this video, I'll go over working with user-defined parameters. This is an advanced feature of the professional edition of 5Spice, so I assume you already know how to use the program. Since the name user-defined parameters is so long, I will call them user parameters in this video. So let's get started. Several different things can be called parameters in Spice, so let's see if we can take a look at that. If we edit values in a simple component, sometimes these values would be called parameters. Okay. If we have a diode symbol, and notice this one's already linked to a model in the Spice library, and we edit that, we see the model and where it is in the library, but we also see the actual description of the model here. And when we see something like BV equals 600, that's called a model parameter. In fact, all of these are model parameters. And notice here in 5Spice, this is a predefined device, and we don't have a way to modify these values. So we will not be looking at this again in this video. However, if we have a subcircuit, and here's our subcircuit symbol, and this is pre-linked to subcircuit from Christoph Basso's Power 456 library for switch mode power supplies. So here's the name of it, and here's where it is in the library. And this is a listing of the model. But notice that here, unlike most subcircuits you'll see, a new tab has appeared, Subcircuit Parameters. So we take a look at this, and these are definitely parameters. And in the subcircuit, 5Spice requires they all have a default value. And then you can see you can change, you can override the default value. And presently we've overridden ratio down here and period up there. One other area which we could consider as well is let's go up and call up an analysis here. And many of you are familiar with the fact that we can sweep a component value in 5Spice. But generally in the basic and standard editions we can only sweep what's called the primary component value. Well, we'll see in a bit that by using user-defined parameters in these entries here, we'll be able to sweep any value. But what are user parameters, and how would you use them? User parameters are project-specific names you define that have an associated value or number, or an equation that computes a value. So let's take a simple example. Suppose we wanted the value of R2 to be the same or be tracking the value of R1. Let's take a look at how we do that. Since these are project-specific parameters, you go to Project, and there it is, user-defined parameters. And basically what you do is on one side here you enter a name. So my param1. And on this side you enter the value or an equation, but let's stick with the value for the moment. So we could do that, but let's add another one while we're here and call this my param2. And now we'll do the tricky thing here. When you actually use a parameter, you need to enclose it in braces. So we're going to make my param2 be equal to my param1. That will, well, you'll see how that will work for us in a moment. So we can close that. Well, that's a little frustrating because now we can't see what we're doing. So there's an easy way around that. We come over to the test point toolbar, and at the very bottom there's user-defined parameters. And that's a symbol now. This is a symbol that you can put as many of these in the schematic as you want. It says double-click to edit, and here we are again. And this time it says, do we want to show the parameters in the schematic? So let's say you can show one or all of them. Let's say we're going to show all of them. So there we are. Now we need to go a little further. So now we want to take this resistor and put in my param 1. And notice that everywhere I'm using it, I'm enclosing it in these braces, these curly braces. And for R2, we can put in my param 2. This may be sort of a trivial example. After all, it's not that hard to change the value of both resistors at the same time. But suppose we went back here and we said, oh, well, I've changed my mind. I still want resistor 2 to track resistor 1, but I only want it to have half the value. So in other words, I've got an equation now. So my param 2 is going to be half the value of my param 1. And that's it. So in other words, this is now a 5K resistor. My param 1 is 10K. My param 2 is 5K. And we'd have to run a simulation to actually see that. And furthermore, if we want to change the value of R1 now, we go back and just double click this, change it as we will. But because we've defined my param 2 with this equation, it will still track this first parameter, even if I change this value. And you can imagine circuits in which you have multiple copies of components that you want values to track in, and so forth. Okay, so let's take this up a notch. Alright, now we have this equation, which is half of my param 1. But we're not limited to doing that. So if we double click this, we bring up a dialog in which we have various math functions available here. We have some constants, we have the general math arithmetic operators, and we have circuit temperature available as a predefined parameter. So at this point, we could say, if we wanted to do the square root, now we'll leave that there. So now we've got my param 2 with an equation, square root of half the value of my param 1. This will check for syntax errors if we screw up. And you can see it's here, and you can come down here, and it sort of extends off to the side, but you can see that the square root is there. So now let's look at where else we can use these parameters. Now we've seen how to define them. Coming back here to the subcircuit, remember this particular subcircuit, here's our usual page, has this extra page of subcircuit parameters, which are defined in the subcircuit file. And they have the default values. Well, instead of 10 micros, we could put in my param 1, or, we could put in my param 3, which we haven't defined yet. And before we ran the simulation, we would have to do it. But you can look down here, and this shows the user-defined values, and you can see we've got my param 3 in here. So we would double-click this and define a value for that. The other place where we looked before is actually in the analysis itself. So here we could put in my param 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. I'll put in 4. And we could say that was going to go from 5K to 20K in, say, 2 steps, and we would enable the sweep. So everything I've done here is the same as, this could be R1 or R2 conventionally in SPICE. 5K to 20K in 2 steps, and we've enabled a sweep. But here we're going to actually sweep the parameter value, and anything that uses my param 4 will be swept. Whether it's an equation, whether it's just a resistor value or a capacitor value, even if it's one of those sub-circuit parameters we just looked at. So that's very powerful, especially if you have a component like, for example, well, like a transformer, where there are in the transformer there are quite a few different parameters, and so we could, and normally we can only sweep one of these but in the professional edition, using the user parameters, you could sweep any of these. So that's what I wanted to show you, and thanks for watching.